Friends and viewer, Alias Grace, a novel by Margaret Atwood. Margaret Atwood, one of his another one of her another outstanding novel, Alias Grace. This novel is inspired by an actual historical event. Alias Grace follows the story of convicted murderess Grace Marks. Born in Ireland, Grace immigrated to Canada at age 12 along with her parents and siblings. Grace's mother died on the journey and was buried at sea, a deep loss that Grace is still grieving in adulthood. And Grace's father was an abusive alcoholic. Shortly after immigrating to Canada, Grace left her family to find work as servant. While working at the house of Mrs. Alderman Perkinson, Grace befriended a fellow servant named Mary Whitney and was devastated when Mary died of complication from an abortion. After Mary's death, a depressed Grace ultimately takes work at the home of Mr. Thomas Skinner in Richmond Hill, today a suburb of Toronto. Grace had a tense relationship with Nancy Montgomery, the housekeeper and Mr. Skinner's paramour, and with James McDermott, a hired hand at household. However, she was on friendly terms with Jamie Walsh, a boy from a neighboring family, and Jeremiah the peddler, a traveling salesman. In 1843, when Grace was 16, Mr. Kinnear and Nancy were murdered under brutal yet mysterious circumstances. Grace and McDermott were both arrested and tried in the murder of Thomas Kinnear. McDermott was convicted and Grace was deemed guilty as an accessory to murder. Since McDermott and Grace were convicted, the Montgomery murder was never tried. McDermott was hanged, but Grace's sentence was commuted to life in prison. By the time the novel begins in 1859, Grace has been in prison for over a decade, having also spent some time in an insane asylum. She claims to have no memory of the day the murders took place. Though she remembers the days leading up to and after the murders, though she remains imprisoned, Grace works at the governor's house several days a week, where she helps the governor's wife with sewing. The governor's wife is part of a group of people led by Reverend Weringer, who are working to obtain a federal pardon on Grace's behalf. In an effort to strengthen his committee's argument for a pardon, Reverend Weringer enlists the help of Dr. Simon Jordan, an American Harvard-educated doctor with dreams of opening his own privately funded mental asylum. Dr. Jordan begins interviewing Grace on a regular basis, hoping that allowing her to narrate her life story will help call up her lost memory of the murders. At the same time that he is conducting his interviews with Grace, Dr. Jordan guilty begins an affair with his landlady, Mrs. Rachel Humphrey, whose husband, Major C.D. Humphrey, has abandoned her. As Grace comes to the end of her story, Dr. Jordan begins to panic because he still cannot determine whether or not she is guilty. After speaking to the lawyer who represented Grace, Mr. Kenneth Mackenzie, and visiting Mr. Kinnear's home in Richmond Hill, Dr. Jordan agrees to allow Dr. Jerome Dupont, a friend of Reverend Weringer's, whom Grace recognized as Jeremiah, the peddler in disguise, hypnotize Grace. During the hypnosis, Grace begins to speak in Mary Whitney's voice. Mary Whitney admits to possessing Grace and killing Nancy, accounting to Grace's lack of memory about the murders. and several sleepwalking spells that Grace had since Mary died. Dr. Jordan realizes that he is trapped. He cannot write a report detailing the hypnosis session because he will be seen as a quack and his dreams of opening his own asylum will be quashed. He also knows that Reverend Vanny Wiringer will not let him off without writing a report on behalf of the committee. Panicked by his situation and distressed by his many interviews with Grace, Dr. Jordan persuades Rachel Humphrey that he is ill and needs her to fetch him a doctor. While she is gone, Dr. Jordan escape back to the state on a train. Dr. Jordan becomes tactically engaged to a woman his mother picks out for him. Upon the outbreak of the Civil War, Dr. Jordan enlists as a military surgeon. He sustains a head injury and, according to his mother, loses his memory of his time in Canada. However, despite his claim to not remember treating Grace, Mrs. Jordan admits that her son mistakenly refers to his betrothed as Grace. After 28 years of imprisonment, Grace receives a pardon in 1872. She is transported to Ithaca, New York, where she remarries Jamie Walsh, now a widower. At the close of the novel, Grace is on the verge of her 46th birthday. She suspects she is pregnant, though she admits it might also be menopause or a tumor like the one that killed her mother, saying, "It is strange to know you carry within yourself either a life or a death, but not to know which one." So, this is the story of Alias Grace by Margaret Atwood. Let me tell you about the key facts of this novel. The title of this novel is Alias Grace, published in 1996. Modernism, historical fiction genre of this novel, setting in Kingston, Richmond Hill, and Toronto, Ontario. Climax of this novel is when Jerome Dupont, Jeremiah the Battler, hypnotizes Grace and Mary Whitney's voice announce that she has been possessing Grace intermittently. Antagonist of this novel is, though Grace may be a murderess, Atwood portrays her in a sympathetic light. The truly antagonistic forces in the novel are the men who exploit and even abuse Grace, including the prison guard, Dr. Bennerling, James McDormand, and arguably both Mr. Kinner and Dr. Jordan. So this is the story of Alias Grace, and located in Richmond Hill, Ontario, near where the 1843 murder took place. So I hope you will enjoy this novel by reading it in thoroughly. Thank you very much.